The night was heavy with rain, the kind that blurred the edges of the world and soaked through even the thickest camouflage. Captain Ethan Cole crouched behind a half-crumbled wall, his rifle tight against his chest, the echoes of battle still ringing faintly through the valley. The war had taken so much already, brothers, sisters, and friends. But nothing compared to the loss of her. Lieutenant Ava Ramirez, his second in command, his closest friend, and the woman who had once made the battlefield feel like it still had a heartbeat. 2 years ago, she was declared missing in action after an ambush that left their convoy in flames. Ethan had searched the smoking wreckage himself, calling her name until his voice broke. They found nothing. No trace, no body. Just her dog tags, bent and blackened, lying beside the ruins of a medic truck. He had carried those tags in his pocket ever since. Tonight was supposed to be a simple humanitarian escort. The fighting in the region had died down, and Delta Team was assigned to secure the passage for civilians from a destroyed village. Ethan moved through the muddy street, signaling his men to spread out. The air was tense but quiet, filled with the hum of generators from a nearby field hospital. As he reached the open courtyard, a line of stretchers was being unloaded. Dozens of wounded soldiers and refugees, bloodied, burned, exhausted, were being rushed into tents by overworked medics. Ethan removed his helmet, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair, and took a long, slow breath. He was used to this sight, but it still struck deep. Every life saved was a small victory in a world drowning in loss. He turned to leave when a voice crackled through his comms. "Sir, we have one more evac coming in from the ridge. She's badly hurt. Medics say she might not make it." Ethan nodded and started walking toward the landing pad where a chopper was descending through the rain. The rotors whipped up mud and debris as 2 medics jumped out, carrying a stretcher between them. He didn't look at the face. He rarely did anymore. Too many faces haunted his dreams already. But something caught him. Something about the way the wounded soldier's hand clenched tightly around a small piece of fabric, a gesture that looked achingly familiar. He stepped closer, and his breath caught in his throat. It was her. Her hair was shorter, uneven, matted with mud and blood. Her face was pale, hollowed by exhaustion, but her features were burned into his memory. Ava. His chest tightened so hard it felt like his heart forgot how to beat. For a moment, the world around him fell away. The rain, the noise, the war, it all faded. All that remained was her face, and the unbearable disbelief that she was alive. "Lieutenant Ramirez," he whispered, his voice trembling. There was no response. Her eyelids fluttered, her lips moving slightly but without sound. The medic shouted something, pulling her stretcher toward the triage tent. Ethan followed like a ghost, his boots splashing through puddles, his mind unable to process what was unfolding. Inside the tent, the air smelled of antiseptic and iron. A dozen bodies lay on cots, each one a story of survival and loss. Ava was placed on a table, and a doctor barked orders. Gunshot wound to the side, severe blood loss, hypothermic, get plasma started, now. Ethan stood in the corner, drenched, shaking. He wanted to speak, to reach out, to tell her he never stopped believing. But his voice wouldn't come. He watched as they cut open her uniform, ripped, burnt, stitched together in places with makeshift thread. She had survived something terrible, something no one should. And yet, here she was. Hours passed. The chaos of the tent swirled around him, but Ethan didn't move. Finally, one of the medics approached quietly. "Sir, she's stable. Barely, but she's holding on. You can talk to her." He nodded numbly and stepped forward. She looked impossibly fragile now, wrapped in blankets, tubes running into her arms. Her breathing was shallow, her lips colorless. He hesitated, afraid this was another cruel trick of his mind. "Ava," he said softly. Her eyelids trembled again, and then, faintly, she whispered, "Ethan." His name, his real name, spoken through cracked lips. He dropped to his knees beside her, emotion breaking through the iron mask he'd worn for years. "I'm here," he said. "God, I thought you were gone." A single tear slid down her cheek, mixing with the grime. "Didn't think I'd make it," she murmured. "But I heard you calling me that day." He felt his breath hitch. "You heard me," she nodded weakly. "In the smoke, I couldn't move. Everything was burning. I tried to crawl, but they took me prisoners. Months, maybe years. I lost track. Her hand trembled as he took it in his own. I kept thinking, you'd come. Ethan closed his eyes, pressing her hand against his forehead. I never stopped looking, he whispered. Never. For the next few days, he barely left her side. When his team tried to convince him to rest, he refused. He watched her sleep, her chest rising slowly with each fragile breath, and every time she opened her eyes, it felt like a sunrise after years of darkness. The rest of the soldiers in the camp began to whisper. Some couldn't believe it, others called it a miracle. But to Ethan, it was something deeper. It was proof that hope, no matter how buried beneath pain and time, could still find a way to breathe. A week later, Ava began to regain strength. The doctors were amazed. They said she should have died from infection long before rescue. But she laughed softly and said, I had a promise to keep. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Ethan wheeled her outside the tent. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, but it felt peaceful for the first time in years. They sat quietly, watching the horizon. You still carry them? She asked suddenly. He frowned. Carry what? She smiled faintly. My dog tags. He reached into his pocket and pulled them out. The metal was still bent and blackened, just as he had found it. She stared at them for a long moment, tears gathering in her eyes. I thought if you had them, she whispered, some part of me would stay alive. He placed them gently in her hand. You did stay alive, he said. You always did. She looked at him, eyes glistening, and for a heartbeat, the world stilled. Around them, soldiers moved quietly, some laughing, some crying, some simply existing. But between Ethan and Ava, there was a silence that said everything words could not. 2 years of grief, hope, and unspoken love lived in that moment. Then, without warning, her hand slipped from his. Panic surged through him, but she smiled faintly. Don't worry, she whispered. Just tired. He exhaled shakily and took her hand again. You rest, he said softly. I'll be here when you wake up. As days turned into weeks, her body healed, but the scars ran deeper than flesh. She told him about the months in captivity, how she helped other prisoners survive, how she refused to give up even when everything seemed lost. I remembered what you said, she told him once, her voice barely above a whisper. You said heroes aren't the ones who never fall, they're the ones who stand back up. So I did. Every day, I stood back up. He felt something break inside him, a mixture of pride and sorrow so strong it almost crushed him. You were always the bravest of us, he said quietly. When she was finally cleared for transport back home, the entire base came to see her off. Soldiers lined the runway, saluting as she was lifted into the medical aircraft. Ethan stood beside the ramp, his uniform crisp but his eyes tired. She looked at him one last time, her gaze soft. You saved me, she said. No, he replied. You saved all of us. You reminded us why we fight. Not for glory, not for medals, but for each other. She smiled, a real smile this time, and he saw the woman he had known. The fierce, brilliant soldier who could light up even the darkest days. I'll find you again, she said. When this is all over. He nodded, though his throat was too tight to speak. The engines roared, and as the plane lifted into the sky, he stood there long after it vanished into the clouds. Months passed. The war slowly wound down. Ethan was reassigned, leading reconstruction teams instead of combat missions. One morning, he received a letter, handwritten, the paper soft from travel. It was from Ava. She was recovering at a veterans hospital back home, working with amputees and trauma survivors, teaching them how to rebuild their lives. You once told me hope is a weapon, she wrote. I'm learning how to use it now. He smiled as he read it, his chest tightening with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. A year later, when Ethan finally returned home, he visited her at the rehabilitation center. The building smelled of paint and flowers, and laughter echoed from one of the rooms. He found her outside, helping a young soldier learn to walk with new prosthetics. She turned as he approached, sunlight catching the faint scars on her cheek. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she walked toward him, steady and strong. You kept your promise, she said. He nodded. And you kept yours. They sat together on a bench under a blooming oak tree, watching the patients in the garden. The world felt quieter now, but not empty, just peaceful. "You know," she said, "I used to think the battlefield was where we showed our strength. But it's not. It's here, in healing, in forgiveness, in choosing to live again." He looked at her, his voice soft. "Maybe that's what survival really means." Years later, long after uniforms were hung up and medals forgotten, Ethan and Ava stood side by side at a memorial service for their fallen comrades. They read the names aloud, voices trembling but proud. When they finished, she reached for his hand, her grip firm and warm. "We made it," she whispered. He nodded, his eyes shining. "Because we never stopped believing." That night, as the sun set behind the mountains, Ethan sat by the quiet memorial wall, tracing the engraved names with his fingers. He thought about everything they'd lost, and everything they'd found. Hope, love, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bond that war could never destroy. Somewhere behind him, he heard her footsteps. She sat down beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. For a long while, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer filled with ghosts, it was filled with life. And when the stars began to appear, faint and steady, she whispered the same words that had brought him back to her on that rainy night long ago. "Ethan." Just his name, soft and real and alive. He turned to her and smiled through tears. "I hear you," he said. In that moment, under the endless sky, two souls who had walked through hell finally found their peace. They had been soldiers, survivors, and, in the end, something even greater, proof that even in a world torn by war, love could still come home.